Hi, this is Keaton Kira. I'm a soon-to-be international master living in Dallas, Texas, and we're going to be talking about the dragon today. So white starts off E4, black plays the Sicilian defense, knight F3, D6, D4, standard open Sicilian. Black takes on D4, knight takes D4, knight F6, knight C3, and of course from this position, black has many Sicilians to choose from, and G6, black goes into the dragon. So in this case, white's most dangerous way to respond to the dragon is the Yugoslav attack. The Yugoslav attack is the only opening that I believe is any real threat to the dragon. So for the Yugoslav attack, white starts out bishop E3, and white's idea is to use this bishop to neutralize black's powerful dragon bishop, which will be fianchettoed on G7, breathing fire down the long diagonal. So bishop E3, and black plays bishop G7. It's a common idea here for black to want to trade off this knight for white's dark squared bishop, which would allow black's dragon bishop to have free reign. But there's a problem with playing this move, knight G4, immediately. If you'd like, you can pause the tape here and try to find the problem. This move, knight G4, is losing for black after white's response, bishop B5 check, and black has no good way of dealing with this check. If bishop D7, then simply queen takes G4, wins a piece. So black isn't ready yet for knight G4. He goes bishop G7, and now white plays F3, which keeps black's knight out of G4 and prepares for him to later play G4 himself, which is a common idea when white's castled on the queen side. And now if white decides not to play F3 and plays queen D2, continuing to prepare to castle queen side, now this knight G4 works for black because there's no white queen aiming at the knight. So here knight G4 is a good idea for black. So white plays F3. The next two moves for black are interchangeable. He can castle or play knight C6, but those should always be his next two moves. Say castles, for example, white plays queen D2, preparing to castle queen side, and knight C6. And here white has three main options. For the most part, two main options. He can play bishop C4, or he can castle queen side now. And these moves are very different, and we'll look thoroughly at both of them. And today I plan to focus on this move 9, bishop C4. The other move, which is a very rare move, is G4 in this position, but we won't get into that just yet. So let's try to understand the difference between these two moves, castling queenside and bishop C4. So if white castles queenside, he doesn't have this bishop on C4, which is covering D5 and E6, and that gives black some added options. Here he can play knight takes D4, bishop takes D4, and bishop E6, and develop this bishop to a good square where it's putting pressure on white's queenside. Or black can go for the central break D5, which breaks open the center and gives black good chances to equalize and have a comfortable position. However, if white plays bishop C4, these options are no longer possible because of the bishop's control on this diagonal. So here black has to settle for bishop D7. And here, as we're going to see in a game today, one of the main plans for black is to go rook C8 and then play after white's bishop has to move, which we'll see. Black's going to go knight e5 and knight c4 and trade off his knight for that bishop. Now, one thing that I want to mention, let's say that white castles queenside on move 9 instead of playing bishop c4. Here it would be a very bad idea for black to go for that same plan of bishop d7, rook c8, and transferring his knight to c4, because now white's bishop is going to take that knight from its starting square, having never moved, whereas in the other variation, which we'll see today, that bishop moves twice. It moves to c4 and then to b3. So this basically saves white 2 tempos, and then the dragon, which is such a sharp opening where both sides are castled the opposite way and attacking the opposing king, certainly losing 2 tempos would be a disaster. That means that you're going to lose the game. So let's look here at bishop c4, and here black continues bishop d7, and now white castles queenside, preparing to do a pawn storm on the king side. There's a few moves for black here. It's possible to play rook c8, a very natural move, putting the rook on the c file and x-raying the bishop. There's a move here, rook b8, known as the Chinese dragon. Rook b8 looks a little bit strange, but the idea is that black is going to advance b5, and this rook will be useful on the b file. And there's a common move, queen a5 here, which is a very common attacking move in the dragon. Queen a5, it's possible to play here. Today we're going to talk about rook c8. So rook c8, which was the first line of the dragon that I ever learned. I always played this line as a kid. The rook is x-raying that bishop on c4, and white has to do something about it. If he were to continue with h4, now black has a winning tactical shot. Knight takes d4. White has to recapture with his queen to protect the bishop, and now after knight g4, with his triple attack on the queen and both bishops, white's losing material. So h4 is not possible. White goes bishop b3, keeping his bishop on this strong diagonal, and black plays knight e5. And notice how this rook is bearing down on the c file. It has a lot of scope, and it's putting pressure against white's king. And very often in this position, black will sometimes sacrifice an exchange on c3. He'll sacrifice the rook for that knight in order to open up white's king. It's a very common idea in the dragon. So this bishop on g7 looks a little bit covered up right now, but we'll see how that changes as the position unfolds. So after knight e5, white should play h4 and begin his attack. And now black has an option here to play h5 and stop white's attack. It's a very sharp line. Personally, I don't like it for black. I think it goes against a lot of the principles of the dragon, which are don't move the pawns around your own king, instead focus on attacking the other person's king. So I don't really like h5, but it is a legitimate line. Knight c4, though, is more common. Bishop takes c4, rook takes c4, and now we're going to be following a game that Karpov played against Korchnoi shortly before Karpov became the world champion. And here in this game, Karpov played h5, sacrificing the h-pawn in order to open the file for his rook. Knight takes h5 and g4. Knight back to f6, and now white needs to think about how he wants to continue his attack. It's very tempting to play this move bishop h6 now, and this is indeed a fine move, but there's an unnecessary complication with bishop h6, and that is that allows black the tactical resource knight takes e4, attacking the queen and with the double attack on this knight on d4. And knight takes e4 is a very sharp line. White has several options here. The best is considered queen e3, actually. Let's look for a minute. Let's say that if he plays knight takes e4, d4, rook takes d4, and queen h2, and here black trades on d1, and white should take with his king because he needs this rook on the h file for his attack. So white takes with his king, and it looks like white's attack is very strong, but here black has some options where he can sacrifice an exchange and have an okay position. For example, he can even play something like bishop takes b2, and after bishop takes f8, king takes f8, queen takes h7, it looks like white's attack is really good, but it's actually not so amazing because a common theme in the dragon, when this bishop controls these squares, there's no way for white to get a checkmate here because the bishop controls all the squares where the queen would like to go. So black is actually okay here. So let's look at the more common move after knight takes e4, queen e3. And here black sacrifices the exchange like we talked about. White's forced to take with the pawn and have his king opened up. And now black retreats, knight f6, bishop takes g7, king takes g7, the standard queen h6 check. King h8 is a very important move, king h8, because black needs this resource, rook g8, rook g7, sometimes to be able to defend this pawn. And here black is fine. This position is considered equal. This knight on f6 holds the pawn on h7 very nicely, so there's no mate threat. And if you try to dislodge the knight with g5, it's a typical dragon theme, knight h5, ruining the coordination between the queen and the rook. And here, for example, if white sacrifices the exchange back in order to open the h file, takes, and queen takes, here black needs that idea, rook g8, and after rook h1, he's just in time with rook g7, defending that h7 pawn. So Karpov was a very safe player. He didn't like to take unnecessary risks. And so instead of playing bishop h6, he played this move knight on d to e2, which will prevent this knight e4 idea. And it also keeps an eye on this other knight because, as we said, a lot of times black will be looking to sacrifice an exchange on c3, and that knight on e2 watches that knight on e3 nicely here. So what else is there for black to do except continue with his attack? Queen a5. White played bishop h6, and they traded. And rook c8. So this is a very important position. Both sides have the attacking setup that they want. Black has his rooks barreling down toward the king on the c file, with the queen out on a5 to help. And white has his queen and rook lined up on the h file. That h7 pawn is being held by a thread, right, with this knight on f6. And here, Karpov played a strong prophylactic move, rook d3, which further prevents any of black's nonsense with taking the knight on c3, which can be a common idea here. Let's take a look and see if white plays more aggressive with this move g5. After g5, of course, black is forced to play knight h5, like we talked about. And now let's say that white's knight comes into f4, trying to distract that knight. Of course, it can't be taken because queen h7 and queen h8, it's mate in 2. So knight f4. Here, black has a very common counter-attacking idea, rook takes c3. And after pawn takes c3, queen takes c3, threatening mate and preparing queen a1, black's position became very good. And after rook takes c3, if knight takes h5, here after rook takes c2, king b1, rook takes b2, black at least has a draw by perpetual with queen c3 and queen c2 check, and black might even have an opportunity to play for more. So this idea for white to play knight f4 doesn't work yet. So that's why Karpov, he played here rook d3, further supporting this knight and preparing to play g5 and then knight into f4 or g3. So in this moment, there wasn't so much theory known about this position, and Korchnoi made a mistake here. He played rook on 4 to c5. So let's look at how this game finished. Karpov won this game brilliantly for white, and then we'll go back to this position and look at how black should have played, because this position is actually fine for black. So in the game, Korchnoi made this mistake, rook back to c5, but the idea is to prevent white from playing g5. But you see, in chess, it's always annoying when you play a move to prevent a certain idea, and then your opponent plays it anyway. And here, Karpov played g5 with the attack on the knight. So Korchnoi played rook takes g5, and now Karpov played rook d5, a powerful move, intercepting the queen and the rook. And of course, this knight can't take because that knight is pinned down to this checkmate in 2. So after rook d5, Korchnoi was forced to play rook takes d5, and Karpov recaptured with his knight, putting pressure on the knight on f6 and the pawn on e7 with the fork. And Korchnoi found a clever move, rook e8, preventing the fork, and he wasn't worried about knight takes f6 because when black takes back with the e-pawn, it opens up a safe haven on e7 for the black king to escape to. And here black's king is safe on e7. So Karpov didn't take. Instead, he reinforced his knight. He played knight f4, and now every white piece is participating in the attack against black's king. Korchnoi played bishop c6, trying to dislodge that knight on d5, and here Karpov broke through brilliantly and found a way to win the game. And if you would like to find it, pause the tape and have a look. Okay, moving on. So here's the breakthrough. e5. e5, a very forcing move. So black has 2 options. He can either play pawn takes e5 or bishop takes d5. So if pawn takes e5, knight takes f6 check, forcing. Pawn has to take, and now a very nice knight h5, threatening queen g7 checkmate, and pawn takes h5 is met by rook g1 check with mate in 2. Now, you might ask, why did Karpov play e5? Why not just immediately play knight takes f6 check, e takes f6, and knight h5? Well, here, Korchnoi would have the defensive resource queen g5 check, forcing a trade of queens. Although, at first glance, it looks good for white after knight f6 check, winning the exchange. But after king g7, takes, black actually has more than enough compensation for the exchange, and he has very strong kingside pawns, and black is actually much better in this endgame. So that's why Karpov played e5 first, and Korchnoi, who understood he was unable to take on e5, tried the only other option, bishop takes d5. But now Karpov became winning after e takes f6, e takes f6, and now not knight h5, because rook e1 check is mate in 2 now for black. Black received some counterplay when that e-file opened up. But rather, now white has a forced win with queen takes h7 check, king f8, queen h8 check, king e7, knight takes d5 with check. Every move is forcing, and after queen takes d5, rook e1 check skewers that rook on e8. And Korchnoi gave up. So, a very nice game by Karpov. That helps us to understand how black shouldn't play the dragon in this position. So let's go back to the moment where Korchnoi played that mistake, rook on 4 to c5. And let's look at the correct way to play this position. It's been discovered now that black should play 19, bishop e6, which introduces the bishop into the kingside attack, and the bishop also covers that important square on d5 where white will often put a knight. So after bishop e6, let's say that white plays the forcing move g5, which is very common. Knight h5, and now knight f4. And now I think we're already familiar with the move for black. Rook takes c3. And for example, if rook takes c3, rook takes c3, and pawn takes c3, now after queen takes c3, black's position became very good. He has plenty of compensation for the exchange. And after this move, knight takes h5. There might be several perpetuals here with queen a1 check and queen d4 check, where it's hard for white's king to escape to e2 because of bishop c4. But I don't think that black needs to settle for a perpetual here. He can play simply pawn takes h5. And remember, he's never getting checkmated here as long as his queen controls this diagonal, keeping white's queen out of h8. So here, black can make a draw at his leisure, and there's opportunity to look for ways to play for a win. So that concludes our video today. Looking at the dragon, in particular the Yugoslav attack with bishop c4, and we'll be back with more variations next video. Hi, this is Keaton Kira, and we're going to continue talking about the dragon today. And this time, since we talked about when white plays bishop c4 on move 9 last time, we're going to be talking about another alternative today. And I'm going to be taking you through a game that I played a couple of years ago in the U.S. Chess League against Robbie Adamson. So let's look at the opening. So we go into the Sicilian. And I played this move knight f6 on move 3. It's not necessary to play this move. Of course, you can take on d4 and play the main line, but this is a transposition into the main line. And the point of knight f6 avoids some other possibilities for white here. For example, after take, and knight f6. Here f3 is an option with the idea of trying to put black in the bind. And of course, the true dragon can't be put in the Maroczy bind. The accelerated dragon can, but not the regular dragon. So I like to avoid that position. And here, after knight f6, if white plays this move, pawn takes c5, we don't recapture, which would lead to a good position for white. We play this move queen a5 check, forking this pawn, and if white responds with knight c3, we can play knight takes e4 with a comfortable position here for black. But very rare for white to take on c5. So after knight f6, Adamson replied knight c3, takes on d4, knight takes d4, g6. So we enter the mainline dragon. And This was a good battle between pretty evenly matched players. Both Robbie and I are IM elects. We both have all of our IM norms, but are awaiting a 2,400 FIDE rating before we can get our title. And Robbie actually beat me the following year in the USCL match, so he got his revenge from this game. So in this one is G6, Bishop E3, going into the Yugoslav attack, the most dangerous attacking setup against the dragon. And the only one I think Black really needs to be concerned about. Bishop G7 and F3, keeping that Black knight off G4. Knight C6, and Queen D2, and castle. So we reached that main dragon position where White has the option to play Bishop C4, which is what we talked about in the last video, where we saw that Karpov-Korchnoi game. And the other main move here for White is to castle queenside. And that's what happened in this game. So White castled queenside, and here Black has two main options. He can play D5, which breaks open the center and usually leads to a comfortable position. Or it's possible to play what I played in this game, knight takes D4, and after bishop takes D4, to play bishop E6, and here Black's plan is to play queen A5, rook C8, rook B8, B5, and B4 with a monstrous attack. And Robbie played the best and the trickiest move here, king B1. And the idea behind king B1 is that prevents Black's main move, queen A5. So maybe you can tell me what's wrong with queen A5. You can pause the tape and think about it. Okay, the problem with queen A5 is that here White has a very good move, knight D5, which gives Black big problems. Now the queens are facing, and White is ready to take this pawn on E7 with check. So after Black takes White's queen, White makes this intermediate move, knight takes E7 check, forcing king H8, and now rook takes D2, and White has an extra pawn in the ending. Still, White needs to make a couple of precise moves after rook E8, knight D5. It looks like after bishop takes D5, like Black caught White because it's not possible to recapture because of this mate on E1. But after bishop takes D5, White doesn't need to panic. He can take on F6 intermediately. And White's going to go up by a pawn. For example, after bishop takes A2 check, king takes A2, bishop takes F6, rook takes D6, and White has a bishops of opposite color ending with rooks on the board with the extra pawn, which of course is much better for White. So after king b1, queen a5 doesn't work. So the main move for black here is queen c7, with the idea of playing rook fc8 and then playing queen a5. And Robbie played knight d5 here, which isn't the main move. Usually white continues with h4, just starting his attack. And here black's idea is to go rook fc8, and after h5, now he's ready for queen a5, because after knight to d5, queen takes d2, there's no time for knight takes e7, because after king f8, this knight is under attack. And black will have an extra piece in this ending. But Robbie played this move knight d5, which isn't a bad move. It's been played before. Bishop takes d5, e takes d5, and still rook fc8. Time for black to get this pressure along the c file. And now, for example, if white starts his attack with h4, I can simply take this pawn on d5, bishop takes g7, king takes g7, and queen takes d5 is impossible because black has this mate, this back rank mate on c1. So Robbie played this preventative move, rook c1, protecting the c2 pawn. And I played knight d7. Normally black doesn't want to trade off his dragon bishop, but here white isn't trying too hard to attack black's king side, so my idea was to play positionally to trade these bishops to get rid of white's two bishops advantage, and then try to play with a strong knight against a bad bishop, which is ultimately what happened. So bishop takes g7, king takes g7, h4, and now I had time for this h5 move, stopping white's attack, and that h5 pawn can be reinforced with moves like rook h8 and knight f6. White played g4, and here I would never want to take on g4 because after h5, here white's attack is becoming very strong. But my idea, like I said, was to reinforce that pawn on h5, so I played knight f6, and now white has to make a decision. If he plays g5, attacking the knight, now these pawns are locked up, and white has no future of an attack on the king side. So Robbie took, and I took back with the knight, and it's a good square for the knight, h5. The rook can come to h8 and support it, and then the future that knight can sometimes come into f4 or back to f6. And of course, white's pawns are not so great here. Bishop h3, attacking the rook, and I wanted to play rook h8 anyway. And bishop g4 with some ideas to trade. And I play queen c4. This is a good active move. Now black's queen becomes active. And if white takes this knight after rook takes h5, black is clearly better in light of white's weaknesses. This pawn on d5 is a weakness, and these pawns are very weak. So white continued rook e1, putting pressure on this weak e7 pawn. And here, it looks like white's pressure is becoming strong, and black has to come up with something. And I found this move, queen f4, which I believe is a strong move. I wasn't worried about going into the endgame, even though I would be down a pawn. Because if queen takes f4, knight takes f4, and rook takes e7, here I'm not going to recapture this d5 pawn, because then after rook takes b7, white is doing pretty well. But my idea was to play rook e8 and try to play with active pieces. And now, if rook takes b7, black has the tactical shot, rook takes h4, activating black's pieces and giving him a good position. And if rook takes e8, rook takes e8, here I had to assess this position And I believe that even though black is a pawn down, the activity of black's pieces, this strong rook on the e file, this excellent knight here on f4, and a slightly more active king, I believe gives black at least enough compensation for the pawn that he's down. I like black in this position. So in the game, Robbie decided not to go for that ending and instead played queen c3 check. I played queen f6, and now, of course, if queen takes f6, I can simply take with my king and defend the pawn. My king is very active. Queen c7, putting pressure on more weak pawns. And I play knight f4 now and activate my knight. And Robbie takes that pawn on e7. And here, I could maybe play like I talked about earlier, take, and rook e8. But I think I found an even stronger move. I play rook e8 now. So if queen takes e8, it's possible to play this position with two rooks and the bishop against queen and knight. But the queen and knight coordinate so well together that I felt my position here was comfortable. So white played this move, queen c7. Queen takes b7 isn't possible because rook b8, x-raying this checkmate on b2. So queen c7, and here this position is very sharp, and a lot of things seem to be hanging by a thread, and I found what I believe is a nice tactical resource for black. So why don't you pause the video here and see if you can find it. I played this move, queen takes h4, which turns the position into a real mess. So back rank tactics are hanging everywhere. Of course, rook takes e8, not possible. Queen takes h1, and it's also not possible to take the queen on h4 because rook takes e1, checkmate. So after queen takes h4, it looks at a first glance like white might be lost because now it's threats on both e1 and h1, threatening to take either of these rooks. But white has this move, queen c3 check, which saves his position. I go queen f6 and block, and rook takes h8. Now here, this is decision time. There are a lot of different routes that black can go. I can play queen takes c3, in which case white is forced to take this rook on e8. It's not possible to take on c3 because I take e1 with check and then take on h8. So here, if I take on c3, white would be forced to take on e8, and I can have a position with queen and knight against two rooks and a bishop. Another option, I can play rook takes e1 check. And then after queen takes e1, I take on h8, and I have a position with queen and knight against queen and bishop. And the third option, I can play rook takes h8, and now after queen takes f6, king takes f6, I have a position with rook and knight against rook and bishop. So, which way to go? Certainly, it's not an easy decision, and it wasn't for me. So, you can pause the video here, take some time, and think about which one of these imbalances you would like to play with.
Actually, I thought black was doing fine in all three of those positions, but I remembered a lesson that I learned early on from my coach, Tom O'Connor, who told me that usually a bishop is going to be a little bit stronger than a knight, and that a rook and bishop is usually a little bit stronger than a rook and knight. However, a queen and knight usually dominate a queen and bishop because the queen and bishop can only create threats on one color square, but the queen and knight can attack different colors of squares and create a lot of mating threats. So I played rook takes e1, forcing a position where I had a queen and knight against queen and bishop, and a very strong knight at that. So rook takes e1, queen takes e1, and king takes h8. And here black stands clearly better in this ending due to his activity and the strength of his knight. Bishop c8, b6, protecting the pawn, and queen e4, a good centralizing move for the queen. I played king g7. Everything else I felt was good. My queen is strong on f6. My knight's good on f4, so I wanted to improve my king. a3, preventing any back rank checkmates. And knight g2, preparing ideas like queen f4, where I can trade queens. And even though the queen and knight coordinate well together here, white's king is very safe. I can't really get any threats against the king. And I felt like the ending with knight against bishop would be good for me because I felt my knight was strong, and I have the potential here with the 2-on-1 majority on the king side to create an outside pass pawn, which would give me a good position. So white played c4, protecting this pawn and preparing later for maybe some idea to play b4, c5, and some kind of breakthrough that I have to be careful about. I played queen f4 to trade the queens, and white doesn't have many alternatives here. He trades the queens and activates the king, but my king gets into the center first with king e5, and here the knight is just so maneuverable. I have time to put it literally anywhere that I want on the board. b4, preparing sometimes a c5 advance, but c5 is never a threat as long as the d5 pawn is a weakness. f5, I advance my kingside pawns. Bishop d7 and g5. Bishop c8 waiting, and now I maneuver my knight. And so my threat is to play either knight h4 or knight e1 and just win this pawn. White's forced to bring his king over to protect the pawn. And f4. Bishop a6, and now king d4. The king penetrates, and now white simply can't hold all these weaknesses. So it was desperation times c5. Otherwise, I can just play knight f5, knight e3, and take this pawn. And white's not equipped to defend everything here. So probably try this move c5. I play b takes c5. I wouldn't want to take this way and allow this d pawn to run. And now not recapturing on c5, but rather b5 with the idea to play a4, a5, b6 and make a pass pawn. I play c4 so that my king can get back and I start to run this pass pawn. a4, and king takes d5. Bishop c8 and king c5, preventing a5. And Robbie prepares a5 with bishop d7. And now king b4, preventing a5. Bishop c6, one last trick. King takes a4 doesn't work because b6 check gives white a winning position. But of course I saw that. Knight f5, king d2, and knight e3. a5, I take, king c3, king b6, and white resigned as black has 3 extra pawns and white has no answer for that. So I hope you enjoyed this game, and I felt it was a good representation of how black can play that line of the dragon when white castles on move 9 and then plays the knight d5 setup. And I felt like the way I continued gave black a comfortable game. So next time we can see some of the other sharp lines involving where white castles queenside on move 9. I hope you enjoyed. Thank you.
Hi, this is Keaton Kira, and we're going to talk more about the dragon today. And in this video, we're going to talk about what happens when white castles queenside on move 9 and black responds with d5. So we get to that mainline dragon position, Yugoslav attack for white. And here, white castles queenside. So, as you'll recall, there are two standard responses for black, taking on d4 and following it up with bishop e6. And we saw a game that I played in that line in the last video. And the other main move for black here is d5, breaking open the center. So this video is going to be dedicated to talking about white's responses to this move d5 and how black should continue to get a good position. So here for white, there are three main moves. The most common move is to capture on d5, and as we'll see, there are a couple different ways that this line can be played. Another move, although less common, is queen e1, with the idea of getting the queen off the d file so that this rook x-rays this queen and tries to give black some problems with his pawn on d5. And probably the second most common move, other than taking the pawn on d5, which a lot of people are playing right now, is king b1. And king b1 is a tricky move because now black can't take on e4 because knight takes c6 is winning for white. After queen takes d2, this intermediate move, knight takes e7 check, and white has an extra piece in this ending. So king b1 is becoming more and more common in this position. So let's start with e takes d5. And black responds knight takes d5, and white plays knight takes c6, b takes c6, and now there are two different options here for white. If he's feeling ambitious, he can take the pawn. I don't recommend this for white, and we'll see why. And the main line here is bishop d4, an attempt to simplify the position and play for a small edge for white. So let's see what happens if white gets greedy and takes the pawn. Looks pretty natural. Here, black wouldn't want to go to the endgame, a pawn down, but black has a very nice resource here. This is a good chance for you to pause the video and see if you can find the best move for black in this position. The best move for black here is queen c7, avoiding the queen trade and putting pressure on white's king. If white takes the rook, it's not really a good idea because now bishop f5, threatening checkmate and attacking the queen. The queen is forced to take this rook on f8, and now black recaptures with the king, leaving his bishop attacking white's queen side. So black is threatening checkmate on c2. White has to stop it. Bishop d3. And now queen e5, forking the bishop and this pawn on b2. Now white has a tricky idea. He goes bishop takes f5. And now after queen takes e3 check, king b1, and it's not possible for black to capture that bishop because rook d8 is made. However, black has a forced win in this position. Again, this is a good opportunity to pause the video, see if you can find the forced win for black. It's a very nice move that combines offense with defense. Queen b6, simultaneously threatening checkmate, guarding the checkmate on d8, and after white stops the checkmate with b3, now we can simply capture that bishop, and black has a winning material advantage. So let's go back. We need to see this position. Take. Queen takes d5. Now after queen c7, there's another move for white that's better than taking the rook, although I still wouldn't recommend it. I still think black is a great position. But the other move for white is queen c5, once again trying to trade queens. And black still doesn't want to trade queens. He can play here queen b7 or queen b8. I recommend queen b7, which leaves the b8 square for the rook. So now black is threatening b2. White plays queen a3. Notice that here queen b5, again trying to trade queens, is not a good idea, because here black can simply exchange and follow it up with rook b8, skewering this pawn on b2. If white plays a4, black just goes a6 and kicks that bishop, and after black takes this pawn, black will be much better in this endgame. So instead of queen b5, white goes queen a3, and now black plays rook b8, renewing his threat on this pawn. White plays b3, and now a nice attacking move, bishop f5, putting pressure on c2. White plays very natural, bishop d3, and now with a series of very precise moves, black can get a great and nearly winning position. Here, either queen c7 or queen c6. It's not important which one, queen c7 or queen c6. White takes the bishop, and now surprisingly, black brings his queen into c3, threatening the bishop and with ideas of playing queen a1 check. But white has this simple response, bishop d3, solving all his problems, and it looks like now white is winning with his extra piece and extra pawn, because it doesn't seem like black has any serious threats. However, this position is very misleading. It's actually close to winning for black after this excellent move, rook on b to c8, which completely paralyzes white's position. Here, black has the simple idea of playing rook d8 and capturing on d3, where, of course, if the white's rook recaptures, then there's checkmate on c2. How can white stop this idea? It's very difficult to stop. The d2 square can never be blocked because of queen a1 checkmate. That square has to remain open for the king. Someone tried one time rook e1, and then after rook d8, rook e2, in order to protect c2, but this failed to queen a1 check, king d2, and bishop c3 mate. Believe it or not, this position, after rook on b to c8, is very close to winning for black. Black is already much better. Okay, so let's return to this position after d5 on move 9, and let's see what happens if white takes on d5 and on c6, but then declines to take that extra pawn and rather goes bishop d4. This is a much better move. Here, it's a good idea for black to play e5 and keep pieces on the board. White goes bishop c5, and now black can play either rook e8 or bishop e6, and I recommend bishop e6. Either way, it could easily transpose, but playing rook e8 gives white the option to go for this ending, knight takes d5, take, queen take, trade on d5. And I think black is still fine here after bishop e6, and then after this rook moves, it's possible to take this pawn, because after b3, you can attack this bishop and be able to take this pawn on b3. But there's really no need to give white this option, because after bishop e6, taking this rook on f8 is poison. Here, trading white's dark square bishop allows black a very nice attacking plan to simply play rook b8, queen b4, e4, getting the bishop into the game, and white's queen side is a mess. That's a very bad position for white. And of course, bishop h6 with the pin here is also a threat. So white should never take this rook. The main move is knight e4, and now black plays rook e8. So this position should transpose. And here there are three main moves for white, and I think the easiest way to remember how black should play this position is black has a response for every main move for white. The three main moves for white here are h4, g4, and bishop c4. Against h4, black should play h6, because white's idea is to play h5, and h6 allows black to meet h5 with g5, and here the pawns are blocked, and white's attack has been stymied. g4 has the problem of weakening this f4 square, and I think black should take advantage of that by playing knight f4. And here the ending is fine for black. After taking here, the knight is very well posted on f4. And if the queen moves away, now black can bring his queen out to a5 with a powerful attack. And bishop c4, which doesn't create any pawn weaknesses, can be met by the simple developing move queen c7. And now black's idea is to put his rooks on d8 and b8 and to continue attacking white's queen side. So after h4, black can play h6. And for example, if g4, it's still possible to play this move knight f4. Just remember black's response for each move for white. Okay, let's see this position after d5 if white plays queen e1. So queen e1, of course, prevents d takes e4 because of the simple knight takes c6 with a double attack on the queen. In my opinion, the best move for black here is e6, supporting the pawn on d5. White will usually continue h4, And now black can play queen c7. Time for black to develop his queen. I've played queen a5 before in this position, but I'm not crazy about it because of a trick that white has sometimes. Like usually here white plays h5, and here black probably needs to play rook e8. Let's say, for example, he plays something like bishop d7. Here it's sometimes an annoying idea to play h6, force the bishop to h8, and then capture on c6, and then capture on d5, which gives white a winning position because now the queens are facing, and white has this knight e7 checkmate. So after queen e1, e6, h4, I think this black queen is better placed here on c7. And now black's idea is to simply take on e4. He's ready to take on e4 and ruin white's pawn structure. And if white takes on d5, black can take with the pawn or with the knight. Probably take with the pawn and leave this knight to defend h7, although either one is okay. And now black is ready to sometimes trade this knight and play bishop e6 and continue with the normal attacking plan here. It's hard for white to attack with his queen on e1. The move that's being tried very commonly today here is king b1 on move 10. So king b1, as I mentioned earlier, prevents d takes e4 because knight takes c6, and then there's this intermediate capture on e7 with check. So after king b1, the main move for black is knight takes d4. And now after bishop takes d4, black can simply take on e4, ruin white's pawn structure, and black has a great position. So after knight takes d4, it's this very strange move that white plays e5. e5, actually ignoring the extra piece that black has sitting on d4 and responding with a counterattack on this knight on f6. And after e5, black actually doesn't have any amazing saving moves here. This move e5 holds up for white. It's a good move. And the best move for black is to play knight f5. So white has to recapture this piece. And here it's possible to take on f6 with either the bishop or the pawn. And I'm going to recommend taking with the pawn, although either is playable. After taking with the bishop, white takes on d5 with the knight, threatening knight takes f6, and taking the queen on d8, and here moving the bishop doesn't work because still knight f6, and white will take on d8. So after knight takes d5, here it's necessary for black to sacrifice its queen. Queen takes d5. White recaptures, and now knight takes e3, forking the queen and the rook. Queen d2, black takes the rook, and after the dust settles, black has a rook and bishop for a queen, with some nice pressure in the center and sometimes on the queen side, although I don't feel like black has quite enough here for his material deficit. I feel like this position should be a little bit better for white. I played this position several years ago against Grandmaster Shabalov, and I made a bad move here. I couldn't remember if I was supposed to play bishop f5 or bishop e6, and I played bishop f5 thinking it was a logical move to put pressure on c2 and try to get my rooks in the center. But after this move, bishop c4, very accurate move, with the idea of playing bishop b3 and defending c2, my bishop became very bad on f5, and I lost this game. The better move here for black is bishop e6. And say, for example, after bishop d3, black's idea is to play rook d8, bishop f5, and take advantage of that pin. So even here, white should play bishop b5 with the idea of bishop a4 and bishop b3. Black will bring the rooks to the center. Bishop a4, for example. And if black brings the rooks to the center, he can have a comfortable position. So it's a good idea, maybe instead of bishop a4, to play this move, rook d1, and try to activate white's rook instead. So this position is playable for black, but I believe it's a slight edge for white. Let's return to this position where I recommend playing e takes f6. And now the main move for white is bishop c5. And as promised, I'm going to be showing a brilliant game by Grandmaster Badur Jabava, who played black against Katerina Lanho, who I believe is a grandmaster now, and she was an international master at this time. So Lanho was white, and this game went into the dragon. And Lanho opted for the Yugoslav attack. And we got to this position after white castled queenside, and black responded with d5. So Lanho played this move king b1, which seems to be getting played more and more. It's a good test against this d5 line. So Jabava played the main move, knight takes d4, and Lanho responded with this surprising-looking move, e5, ignoring black's extra piece on d4 and counterattacking this knight on f6. And they continued to follow theory, knight f5, and e takes f6, and Jabava took on f6 with the pawn. And white played the main move, bishop c5, attacking this rook on f8. And it's very typical in the dragon for black to be more than willing to sacrifice a rook for white's dark square bishop, because that means that black's dragon bishop won't have an opponent, and black's dark squares can be extremely strong when attacking white's king. So this position, it's a classic example of that. Black plays d4, which is the main move here, daring white to take on f8. And she does. Bishop takes f8, and queen takes f8. So black has a pawn for the exchange and has these two bishops, which will work together very nicely. And white played knight e2 here, which was a novelty, and Jabava mentioned in his notes on this game that it was a novelty not too likely to have many followers after this game. The main move here is knight b5. So white continued knight e2, and black played knight e3, attacking the rook. Rook c1, and knight c4. This knight became very well placed on c4. Queen takes d4. Why not be greedy? And now black needs to find a way to defend this knight on c4. Of course, he doesn't want to move it. He plays pawn to b5, defending that knight and threatening f5, unleashing the bishop. There are those dark squares again with that attack on b2. White played c3, denying the bishop some of the squares on that diagonal. And now bishop f5 check. Black plays forcing. King has to go to a1, and rook d8. Every black piece is in a useful spot. This knight on c4 is excellent. The bishop, of course, denying the king the b1 square. The queen and the rook coordinating well together. And this bishop on g7 hasn't seen the light of day yet, but it will. Queen f2, a passive-looking move. And now black continues with the active rook d2, taking control of the second rank and generating a threat against this pawn. Black is already much better. Queen takes a7. I don't think that white was so much interested in winning the pawn but just getting this queen off of f2 so that this knight could return to the game. And Jabava played knight takes b2, stripping white's king of its shelter. Knight d4 and knight a4, putting pressure on this pawn on c3. White played knight takes b5, and it looks at first glance like maybe white is fine. White has a material advantage, and it seems like there's no clear way for black to continue. But Jabava had other plans, and he found an amazing move here for black. So why don't you pause the video and see if you can find this great continuation. Jabava found an incredible sacrifice. Knight takes c3, double exclamation mark. And this knight can't be taken either way. If the knight takes on c3, now black wins with queen b4, threatening an unstoppable checkmate. If white goes queen a8 check, simply bishop f8. And queen b2 is inevitable. And if rook takes c3, now it's rook d1, where king b2 is met by rook b1 checkmate. So after knight takes c3, white tried bishop c4. Knight takes b5 simply. Queen e3, it wasn't possible to take on b5 because, again, this queen b4 is forcing checkmate. So queen e3, attacking the rook. And now, after this very nice move, bishop d3, white resigned, because white's coordination is completely shot, and black has the move f5 on the way, delivering a checkmate from this bishop, and there's no way to prevent it. For example, if queen takes d2, f5 check, rook c3 is forced, and now black wins the house after bishop takes c3. I hope you enjoyed that game. It was a very nice example of how to play this line for black after white plays king b1 in response to d5.
Hey guys, this is International Master Keaton Kira. I'm glad to be back recording videos for chess.com, and let's get ready to talk more about one of the most exciting variations of the Sicilian, the dragon. So we'll go ahead and start. So black plays the Sicilian defense, and then here's the move order to get into the dragon Sicilian from this main Sicilian position. Black goes g6. And I want to continue talking about the Yugoslav attack today. So for the Yugoslav, white plays bishop e3. Black goes bishop g7. White pushes f3, taking control of that g4 square, preventing knight g4, and of course intending to play g4 himself later on. And black here can play either knight c6 or castles. Queen d2, and castles. And here is a key position where there are two main lines and one move that's become increasingly popular in this position. In our last couple of videos, we talked about this line where white goes ahead and castles queenside, and I recommended that black play d5. I believe I talked about that in videos part 2 and part 3. On the Sicilian dragon. And we've also talked a little bit about when white plays bishop c4, a very aggressive move to bring that bishop out to where it x-rays the king, and it can be a useful attacking piece later. And a third move that's gained a lot of popularity is this move g4, which was actually played in a recent game in the U.S. Championship this past year, a very exciting game, Nakamura against Robson. And that might be something that we discuss more down the road. But today I want to talk about bishop c4. So bishop c4 prevents black from playing d5, and the bishop, it can be very menacing, certainly, along this diagonal. So it's a very serious move that black has to be ready for. And the main move here for black is bishop d7, preparing to bring the rook to c8, where it can be powerful along that half-open c-file. So bishop d7, and here white normally castles or sometimes goes bishop b3 first. And now black can go ahead and play rook c8. This is one of the lines. And white would normally castle here, but in some cases he can play an early h4. These moves are somewhat interchangeable. What I want to discuss, in the first video, we talked about what happens in this position where after white castles, black goes knight e5, pawn to h4, and then knight to c4. And I showed a very interesting game, Karpov against Korchnoi, where Karpov won with white in brilliant fashion. Today, the topic of this video is going to be what happens when black doesn't allow the white pawn to go to h5. So in this case, let's say, for example, white plays the early h4. As soon as he plays h4, black has a defensive idea to immediately go pawn to h5 and not allow the pawn to go any further. Now, I have mixed feelings about this move, pawn to h5. I feel like in general, in a position where both sides are going to be castled the opposite way, you don't really want to move the pawns around your king, because in a lot of ways it makes your opponent's attack easier. However, white is already going to have a very strong attack, as black can do also in these positions, and I feel that by playing pawn to h5, it's a good way of slowing down white's attack and making it more difficult for white to attack in this position. And this line has become increasingly popular recently, played by a lot of the strongest grandmasters in the world, and I feel like it deserves a lot of attention. So we're going to discuss the line in this video, pawn to h5. So white castles and goes back to the normal position, and here black plays knight to e5. And here there are some different possibilities, so I'm going to talk about each of those possibilities, and then in my next video we're going to see a game that happened in this line between a couple of heavyweight grandmasters. So one possibility for white is to play bishop g5. The idea is to have pressure sometimes on the e7 pawn if this knight were to move, and also to be able to capture this knight, which can be a key defender of the h5 pawn. So that's the idea behind bishop g5. Another idea is to go bishop h6 and try to trade the bishops. And then another idea here is to go king b1 and go ahead and tuck the king out of the way first, because this position is going to get very messy, and in a lot of positions it's important for white to try to have his king as safe as possible before the game really becomes crazy. So let's go ahead and talk about king b1 first. King b1 is an important move in all of these variations, and black should almost always answer it with rook to e8. Because rook to e8 is also an important move for black. For one thing, after bishop h6, and allows black to drop the bishop back to h8 and keep that dragon bishop, because now there's no rook on f8 that white's bishop could take. So it gives black that added option of dropping the bishop back and hanging on to that powerful dragon bishop. Another idea of playing rook e8 is that in some positions the white knight will come to d5, and the black queen might not be on d8 anymore, so if his rook were still on f8, then a knight taking on e7 could be a serious threat. But with the rook on e8, we won't have to worry about that. And the third reason for playing rook to e8 is sometimes when white's attack really gets strong, the black king might need to run. And now he has this f8 square available to escape to. So rook e8 is a very prophylactic move. So after rook e8, I want to start by taking you through an opening of a game that I played this last summer at the Badalona tournament in Spain, where I played against a very strong FIDE master named Obregon, who was from Cuba, and he was almost 2,500 FIDE. He had a very strong rating for a FIDE master, and he continued in this position by playing g4. So rather than playing bishop g5 or bishop h6, he immediately tried to crash through. And usually when white plays g4, it's necessary to take. Otherwise, they can take on h5, and their attack starts to become strong. So we go ahead and take on g4, and then Obregon played h5. He had the mentality, as a lot of players do in these kinds of positions, that it's okay to sacrifice as long as you can break through. So h5 in this position is almost always met by knight takes h5. And now he played bishop h6 with the idea of trying to trade off the bishops. And in some positions, a rook sacrifice on h5, which would really peel the defense away from black's king, could be a strong possibility. I'll just show you, for example, let's say black makes a move that really doesn't change the position at all. Here, white could play rook takes h5, and it would be very strong, as pawn takes h5 can be met by the winning move, queen to g5, with an unstoppable pin on this bishop. Of course, black can block that pin, but now we see the power of this light square bishop along this diagonal. White can simply play queen takes g6, and all the pins work in his favor. The bishop's pinning this pawn, the queen's pinning the bishop, and black is checkmated. So these are the kinds of ideas that we have to watch out for in this position, and it's important to make a useful move. And in this case, I played e6, which does a few important things. It blunts this bishop, so the bishop no longer has the pinning power along that diagonal. It frees black's queen, so black's queen can now have scope and come into the game at times and be an important defender. And this move even controls the d5 square, where a lot of times that white knight wants to jump to. So this move really does three things. Pawn to e6. And my opponent here played rook to g1 with the idea of strengthening his attack, putting his rook there and being able to take on g4 now with the f-pawn. Rook to g1. And I played queen f6, putting the queen on a useful square where it protects the bishop. And notice it looks like this move bishop to g5 traps the black queen, as it doesn't have any squares, but black has a simple tactical resource here to get out of that. He can take this pawn on f3 with the knight, attacking white's queen. So now if white were to capture black's queen, black can take with check. He can dump his knight off with check, taking this bishop, and then proceed to capture this bishop and be a full piece up in an easily winning position. And of course, if white plays knight takes f3, black can simply capture on f3 with his queen and save his queen from attack. So bishop g5 doesn't work. So in the game, my opponent made a mistake, and he played bishop takes g7. I took back with my king, and now he played pawn takes g4, and it looks very dangerous for black because the knight is under attack, and the knight doesn't have many good squares to move to. And if the knight comes to f4, then my opponent can play g5 and kick my queen, and I won't be able to defend this knight. But this position, in fact, has already become practically winning for black. But it's important that he finds an important resource here on this move. And this might be a good opportunity for you to pause the video and see if you can find the continuation for black here. Okay, so here, black plays the intermediate move, queen f4. And now my queen is aiming at my opponent's queen. If he were to take, I can simply recapture with my knight and have a very good position with an extra pawn in the endgame and well-placed knights. So my opponent played queen g2. He got his queen out of the way, and now I still have to deal with my knight, but I simply can play knight f6 with a three-way attack against this pawn. He played g5, but now my knight comes very nicely into g4, where these superfluous knights protect each other, and they're both very safe. And this pawn on g5, this once menacing pawn, has now become a sitting duck for my queen to pick off. And so I was able to have two extra pawns, and I won this game. If white were to play queen h3 here, black always has the resource rook h8, and the rooks defend very well. So let's go back to the position where my opponent made a mistake in what seemed to be a very natural-looking move. Bishop captures bishop on g7. But this actually was a very serious mistake. What white needed to play here is pawn takes g4 immediately, without the bishop there, without bishop captures bishop. So pawn takes g4. Now, once again, my knight really has no good squares, so I would need to play bishop takes on h6. And now, white can simply play queen takes h6, and here the position is very different. It looks like I can make the same move, queen f4, but here, white has a very unpleasant surprise in store. Rook takes h5. And now, once again, the queens are facing each other, and it's my queen that's unprotected. If I capture the queen, he can take back with his rook, and white's won a piece. So queen f4 is not possible here. However, I can play queen to g7. Queen to g7 is fine. And, of course, white can't take here with the pawn because his queen hangs. And if he takes with the rook, now I can simply, here I wouldn't want to take his queen, but I can simply take his rook. And he can't take back with the g-pawn because it's pinned to his rook on g1. And black would have a good position. So taking on h5 doesn't work. Here, white simply needs to retreat his queen, and black needs to retreat his knight. And here the black king is safe. White's attack is not too powerful here. White does have some pressure, but it's nothing that black can't survive with his extra pawn. So let's return to this position after black played knight e5 on move 12. So king b1 is one possibility. A second possibility is bishop h6. Very often in the dragon, white wants to trade these dark square bishops to eliminate black's powerful dragon bishop. So bishop h6 is an extremely common idea in the Yugoslav attack. And in this case, black can't avoid the trade with bishop h8 because his rook is hanging on f8. So there are a couple of possibilities after bishop h6. It's possible here to sacrifice an exchange and really create a dynamic position, and you can do this by trading on h6 and then playing rook takes c3, and this somewhat typical dragon exchange sacrifice where that rook sacrifices itself for the knight on c3, ripping open white's king position and saddling white with doubled and isolated c-pawns, which can prove to be a serious weakness. It's not okay to immediately play rook takes c3 after bishop h6. This happened to me in a game once, actually, when I had the white side of this position, because there's a move here, bishop takes g7, which is a very powerful intermediate move, which attacks this rook on f8. So here, black needs to capture the bishop on g7, and his rook on c3 is lost, so he might as well get a pawn for it. Rook takes c2 check, but here white's position is very good. He can simply capture with the king, and after black captures the bishop on g7, white can tuck his king back to b1, and white is just up a clear exchange for a pawn, with black having absolutely no compensation here. So if black wants to sacrifice the exchange, he certainly can, but he has to take on h6 first and then take on c3. And then he can follow it up by bringing his queen out and attacking that c3 pawn, and it's certainly not an easy pawn for white to defend. He doesn't really want to retreat his queen here because white wants his queen for the attack, and in this position black would have a very natural move, a5, putting pressure on this bishop on b3 and really starting to march against white's king, and the attack is very strong. So normally here white plays king b1, and he's willing to surrender that pawn if black wants to take it. He wouldn't want to just start attacking here with g4 and attack blindly, because now after queen takes c3 there's a very serious threat. White can't get away with a move like this now because there's queen a1 check, which forces the king to d2, and then he takes this knight with check. So in this position after queen c7, white usually goes ahead and goes king b1, and it's possible to take on c3, but that pawn's not going anywhere. Black can just go rook c8 here, get his rook in the attack, and the idea for black is to continue with a5 and a4, whereas white at some point wants to get in g4 and have a very powerful attack against black's king. Now, if white were to play f4 here, it's very important to go knight to c4. That knight needs to contend with white's bishop on b3. He wouldn't want to play knight g4 here because of this theme that we've already seen where the bishop pins that pawn, and here white can go queen takes g6 check. But as long as black goes knight c4 here, black is just fine, and it's a very dynamic game from this point. So this is one possibility for black against the bishop h6 variation. And another possibility is just to ignore the bishop on h6 and play the thematic move, knight to c4. So after knight to c4, white would take, black takes with the rook, and now white goes ahead and trades off that dragon bishop and plays the move that white so often plays in this line, g4, in order to try to break through against black's king. But here we're going to see that black is absolutely fine after this move, pawn takes g4, because black has all the resources that he needs to be able to defend his king. So here, white would continue with the typical h5 to try to break through, and that pawn is always uncapturable in this line, because after something like knight takes h5, again rook takes h5, white can break through, queen g5 check, and now not a draw by repetition, but in fact it will be the rook that comes this time to the h file, now that black's pawn is out of the way. So after h5, black plays rook h8. This is one of the benefits to having the black king on g7, as he has the defensive resource rook to h8, putting the rook on the h file and closing down white's attack. So pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn. Now white plays pawn to f4 with the idea of continuing to press against black's king position. But black has a very nice resource here. He can go pawn to e5, striking out in the center and attacking white's knight. Now, if white takes this pawn, black recaptures, and the knight needs to retreat here, in this case to e2. And here black has a nice move, rook to h3, putting his rook on a very strong square. And this position is usually drawn by mutual respect. White doesn't want to take black's rook and give him a protected pass pawn on h3, but it's not easy for black to play for a win either, because he has this pinned bishop and his pieces are not very well coordinated. So white would go here rook f1 with an idea sometimes of taking the knight on f6 with the rook and then capturing on d7. And so black can counter that with rook f3. And once again, white wouldn't want to take and allow black a passed pawn on f3. So he goes back rook h1 with the idea of going queen h6 check, like he wanted to do all along. And now black can counter that again with rook h3. And very often here we see a draw by repetition. The a little bit different variation will emerge if white chooses not to take the pawn on f5, but rather to go knight e2 right away. And now the threat is for white to take this pawn on d6 with his queen. So black plays rook takes h1, rook takes h1, and very aggressively, knight takes e4. So the knights trade on e4, and now white goes pawn takes e5. And it looks like black's in trouble, because now white has queen h6 check on the way. But there's no need to panic in this position. Black has the very calm resource, rook takes e2, the exchange sacrifice. Of course, when I say calm, I'm being a little sarcastic. You need nerves of steel to play this position with black. After queen h6 check, king f7, and the king here can be flushed all the way up the board to e5, but in fact there's no way for white to win this position. Black has enough resources to defend his king. For example, after rook h5 check, king f4, and even queen takes on d6 with check, the king just calmly marches up the board using his pawn, his rook, and sometimes his bishop as a key defender. And white has nothing more here than a perpetual. For example, queen d5 check, king f4, and queen d6 check, and a repetition of moves. So black is known to be fine in that position. There is an alternative for white after rook takes e2. Instead of going queen h6 check, he can take the rook. But now black has queen g5 check. Remember, we talked about how sometimes white makes the prophylactic move king b1 earlier, and it's exactly to avoid moves such as this. So queen g5 check, king to b1, and now queen takes e5. where black has 2 pawns for the exchange, and black is completely fine here. For example, if they go to the endgame, I believe it's black who's pressing to win this position with 3 passed pawns and an active king. So, going back to this position after knight e5, we looked at king b1, followed by g4, and we talked about bishop h6. Now we're going to talk about what's considered to be the main move, bishop g5. This is the most common move in this position. And in my next video, I'm going to show a game in this line between 2 of the strongest players in the world. So you'll definitely want to tune into that video, see more of the theory on this line, and to see an incredible game. Hello everyone, this is International Master Keaton Kira for chess.com, and as promised, in this video we're going to look at a game in the Dragon Sicilian between 2 of the strongest players in the world, and it's time to review who the contestants are. Playing white, we have the pride of Azerbaijan, Timur Rajabov, and playing black, we have, can we say it now, the greatest player of all time, Magnus Carlsen, who recently passed Kasparov's record of 28.51 FIDE. I believe Carlsen became 28.62 or something like that. So Rajabov against Carlsen in an incredible Dragon showdown. So let's get started. So they go to the Dragon Sicilian, with Rajabov playing white, Carlsen playing black, and Rajabov opts for the Yugoslav attack, the most dangerous setup against the Dragon. And he chooses to play bishop c4 on move 9, as we discussed in the last video. Carlsen plays bishop d7, the main move. And now most people castle here, queenside, but Rajabov plays first, bishop b3. It doesn't make a big difference. Carlsen continues with rook c8, and then again most people castle here, but Rajabov chooses the move h4. And now rather than play the line with knight e5, Carlsen elects to play h5 and allow that h-pawn to go no further. So Rajabov castles, and now we've reached the position which we would reach from any other move order, and white continues here with knight to e5, the main idea. So in our last video, we saw the move king b1 and also bishop h6. Today we're going to pay more attention to the most common move in this position, bishop g5. So the bishop goes to g5, where it can be very useful in some positions with pressure against the knight on f6. And against bishop g5, black should play rook c5, because the rook can be a very important piece operating along this 5th rank in this position. The rook is very well placed on the 5th rank, and we'll see why as we continue to see the game. So there are some different options here. For white, he can play king b1, in which case black will play rook e8. We talked about that in the last video. Usually when white plays king b1, black plays rook e8, which is, these are both basically prophylactic moves. White wants to put his king on b1, where it'll be safe from any checks later along the h6c1 diagonal. And black wants to put his rook on e8, which protects his e7 pawn, prepares a square for his king on f8, and gets his rook out of the pin in case white ever plays bishop h6. Then black could respond with bishop h8. But in this case, Rajabov played king b1. For some reason, I was thinking he didn't. Rajabov played king b1, and Carlsen played rook e8. And now Rajabov played g4, which is a very aggressive move, immediately starting the attack against black's king. And g4 is a key theme in almost any way that white plays this position, although he doesn't have to play it right away. But he does immediately play g4, and Carlsen captures on g4. And now Rajabov plays another very aggressive move, h5. I think Rajabov made up his mind before the game that he was going to play very aggressive. It's also possible here to play the move f4 and attack the knight from e5, in which case that knight can go into b5. And now usually white would move his queen to d3 or to e2. Oh, I'm sorry, actually queen e2 is not the best, because this knight on c3 is not protected, and sometimes there can be tactics with knight a3 check. But queen d3 is a little bit stronger, supporting this knight, and now black would play queen c8, which defends the knight and renews the idea of sometimes playing knight a3 check. But Rajabov did not play f4. He played h5, a very direct and very aggressive move. Carlsen captured on h5 with his knight, and now Rajabov went all out. Rook takes h5. Pawn takes h5, and queen h2. So white has sacrificed a ton of material. He's sacrificed 2 pawns and an exchange. But his pieces are in very good attacking formation, and he hopes to be able to score a quick point by having a powerful attack against the black king that black is unable to get out of. So at this point, Rajabov's idea is to capture on h5 with his queen, which will tie the black knight on e5 down to defending the f7 square. We see here this bishop on b3 is so powerful. And then white can bring in reinforcements by playing rook h1 and really have a great attack. The good news for black is he's up so much material that he can afford to give some of it back in defense, which is a very common theme. When you're winning by a lot of material but you're under attack, sometimes you can give back some of that material in order to squelch your opponent's attack but still have enough extra material to win the game. And that's what Carlsen seeks to do. So Carlsen continues with knight to g6. He brings another piece over to the king's side to help support his king. And now we see the power of this rook along the 5th rank. Here it's immediately attacking the white bishop on g5. But Rajabov's not worried about that. He captures on h5, in fact moving his queen into a spot where the bishop on g5 is pinned to it. But white, in fact, has a threat here to capture on g6 with his queen. We saw this idea in the last video where this bishop along this diagonal pins that pawn and allows for a lot of these kinds of tactics with queen takes g6. But strangely, Magnus Carlsen wasn't worried about that, and he played queen to a5, getting his queen out to a powerful square and double attacking this bishop on g5. But what happens if white simply takes on g6, wins a piece, and has a seemingly unstoppable attack? What was Magnus Carlsen prepared to play against this? You might want to pause the video here and see if you can figure it out. If white plays queen to g6, queen takes knight on g6, Magnus Carlsen had a very powerful response. Pawn to e6, which does two things. It blunts this bishop on b3, so the pin no longer exists, which means that the white queen on g6 is now hanging, and of course that bishop on g5 will be lost. So the queen has to reach a safe square, and now Carlsen can simply play rook takes g5, and white's attack is over, and black now has an easily winning position. So a very nice trap set by Carlsen, inviting Rajabov to play the very natural queen takes g6, which in fact fails, to a brilliant defensive move in e6. But Rajabov, being the very strong player that he is, saw his way through that and played f4, defending his bishop and now preparing to take on g6 with his queen. So Carlsen needed to make some things happen here, and he decided to give back the exchange. Rook takes g5. Again, one of the nice things about having extra material, sometimes you can give a little bit of it back to improve your position. So he eliminates that powerful white bishop on g5. Rajabov, of course, takes with the pawn. He has no interest in going to the endgame. And now pawn to e6, a very common move whenever that bishop is on that diagonal. Black is able to cover that bishop's diagonal so that it's no longer so strong. And that pawn on e6 also controls an important square on d5, which a lot of times white's knight would have liked to go to, where it can be much closer to the attack. So pawn to e6, a very useful defensive move for black in this position. But Rajabov found an attacking resource, knight to f5. Not a move you'd normally consider when a pawn had just gone to cover that square, but Rajabov is a strong enough player to see beyond the obvious, and he sees that he can play knight to f5 because after pawn takes f5, he can go queen takes g6 because that diagonal is open again. And that's in fact what happened in this game. Black played pawn takes f5, and now white responded with queen takes g6, threatening to take the f7 pawn with a forced checkmate. So Carlsen has to respond to that, and he plays bishop e6, again fighting to try to dull that powerful bishop on b3. And also, when Carlsen played bishop to e6, it broke the pin on the f7 pawn, which left the queen on g6 under attack. So white had to pull his queen out of the fire. And now, very calmly, pawn takes on e4. Rajabov played rook f1, unrelenting. But now Carlsen's queen found a very powerful square, queen e5, which makes it impossible for this knight on c3 to move because of the checkmate on b2. And the queen on e5 also coordinates very well with the bishop on g7. It defends it. And so often in the dragon, we see in positions where white's dark square bishop is traded off, having a queen or a bishop on this long diagonal, the diagonal from a1 to h8, for black completely protects this king. As long as that diagonal is covered, white really has no way to be able to checkmate the black king. Even if white can get his rook on h1 and go queen h7, so what? Black will just put his king on f8, and the queen or bishop, or in this case both, along that diagonal, cover enough important squares that the white king will never be in any danger. So after Carlsen played queen e5, I think Rajabov was already starting to get nervous because he understood that his attack is starting to stall and black's position is starting to become very good. And Rajabov played rook takes f7, which is really the only try here. And Carlsen continued with a natural move, taking the bishop and simplifying the position into a game where black is clearly better. However, Carlsen missed a nice move here that would have wrapped things up a little more cleanly. And if you want to find it, by all means, pause the video here and go ahead. So Carlsen captured on b3 here, but the move that he should have played is rook to f8, which is a very fearless move, rook f8. So if white goes bishop takes e6, then simply queen takes e6, and white's very happy to do all of these trades. He's simplifying the position and making it easier for him to win. So after rook f8, what else is there that white can try? Not really much. The rooks and the bishops are coming off the board here. He can't go rook to e7 because then rook f1 with checkmate. So he's forced to trade the rooks, and then these bishops, these light square bishops, will also be traded. And keep in mind, in these positions, this bishop on g7 is still so powerful along that diagonal, and he can even take the knight here in the future and convert the position to an easily winning queen endgame. So rook f8 would have been close to lights out. But Carlsen played very natural. Bishop takes b3. Pawn takes. And then he continued with g3. The pawn only being 2 squares away from making a queen with check. King to a2. Rajabov pulled his king out of there. And now rook to f8 with a similar idea to trade off the rooks. And here Rajabov trades the rooks and then continues with queen g4, searching for some kind of counterplay against the black king. Carlsen plays e3. Now he has another pawn that's very close to queening. Pawn to g6, a necessary move by Rajabov to create some threats. That pawn restricts the black's king and, of course, can coordinate with the white queen for some checkmating possibilities on f7, for example. So pawn to g6, and here Magnus Carlsen, the strongest player in the world, blundered. He played pawn to e2, and after this move, the position is no longer winning. This would be a good chance for you guys to pause the video and try to find out why not. What can white play here to save the game? After black plays e2, this position is now a theoretical draw after the move queen to d7, threatening checkmate on f7. If black blocks the checkmate with queen e7, simply queen c8 check, forcing queen to e8. And now he can go queen f5 check. The king would be forced to go to g8, and now queen d5 check with a forced draw by perpetual. Whenever the king's on h8, the white queen goes to f5. Whenever he's on g8, the queen goes to d5. And when he's on f8, queen f5 check. And in this case, king e7 is not possible simply because the knight can take on e2, and now it's actually white who's fighting to win this position. However, after the e2 blunder, Rajabov failed to find queen d7. I think so often in positions where someone knows they're worse for almost the whole game, psychologically it can be hard to find good opportunities because you have the mindset that your position is bad. So Rajabov didn't recognize that he could actually save himself with queen d7, and instead he blundered with the move queen f3 check, handing the win right back to Carlsen. Queen f3 check, Carlsen played king e8, queen f7 check, and king d8. Again, not possible to play knight takes e2 and eliminate the pawn because of the coordination of that queen and bishop. Queen takes b2, checkmate. And how else can white stop that pawn from making a queen next move? Queen g8 check, king d7, queen f7 check, queen e7. And the checks are running out. Queen f5 check, and king d8. Queen a5 check, and b6. No more checks against the black king. White played queen d5, one last desperate attempt, but now black simply makes a second queen. Queen a8 check, searching for a possible perpetual, but it doesn't exist here. King d7, queen b7 check, king hides on e8, and Rajabov resigned, seeing that if he brings his queen to the back rank, the checks run out very quickly here. Queen d8. If queen c6 check, he can go queen d7, the check here, and now king e7. He can try to get his knight into the game, but now the king just runs up the board. Knight f4 check, king f5, and white is out of time. So I thought that was a very interesting game where Magnus Carlsen was able to uphold the dragon's honor and win a great game with black. White chose to sacrifice a lot of material early on in that game and try for a big attack.